Today's guest is one of the most comprehensive and well-researched mining stock experts that's out there today. Actually, probably wrote the best and most comprehensive mining stock book that's ever written on investing in commodities, gold, silver, mining stocks, and really a methodology for how to do it. His name is Don Durrett. And you can see his website, goldstockdata.com. We're going to be talking about gold, silver, commodities, crypto, the crazy economic climate that we're in, how precious metals ties back into the seemingly now, unfortunately, inevitable war that seems to kind of be moving in that direction. And so I want to welcome you to today's show. We want to thank you for listening. Want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Vizsla Silver, one of our favorite silver and gold mining stocks. That is Vizsla Silver. So thank you, Vizsla Silver. And if you're looking forward to today's episode or you enjoy it, please consider smashing the like button on this video. Give us a comment right there down below, both of which help the good old fashioned YouTube algorithm. A lot of the top finance channels and the way YouTube does it now is they give priority to all of the mainstream, big, huge conglomerates on YouTube. One of the ways you can support the independent media channel we're putting out there is helping the good old-fashioned YouTube algorithm with a nice thumbs up, like, comment down below. And if you haven't yet, make sure you hit that subscribe and bell notification. A lot of people have been writing me asking why they are not seeing the videos, and YouTube has it set up that you got to make sure you hit the bell notification. So without further ado, it's good to see you, Don.
Jake, thanks for having me back.
Yeah,
one comment on the book. Thanks for the plug on the book.
Yep.
So, the book is basically a textbook on how to invest in miners. It's also gold and silver, but most of the book is really explaining how to invest in miners. And it's really the only book out there. I think it's the reason why you kind of gave it some glowing terms, because just nobody's really written. It's hard to find anything out there on how to do it. So if you go to my website, on the main menu, it says book. And so there's a link to the book. So if you own any miners, then you probably want to read it. You're going to learn something new, definitely. So thanks for that. Thanks for the plug.
Absolutely. So Don, interesting times. We had the Fed saying inflation 7.5%. I saw the other day the producers, I think it was the producers price index in Germany was, I think it was 25% year over year. The last time it was that high was 1949. Getting pretty crazy. And then now all of a sudden seems like we might actually have some type of, I pray to God we don't, some type of a militarized conflict with Russia. So a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty. How do you make sense of this all? And, also starting to see some life from gold and silver a little bit. How do you make sense of all of this? It seems like it's kind of one after another. I mean, it's hard to believe how much geopolitical, socio, and economic stuff's going on.
Yeah. I don't know when people are going to watch this, but actually, the war actually broke out yesterday. It actually broke out last night. Is when today is the day that they're basically surrounding Kiev. And today was the day that, you would expected, gold opened this morning. It got up to 1970. And then the markets were selling off pretty bad. I don't know how far down the Dow got down, at least 800 points, I think, something like that, 600, 700, 800. And then it turned because people started realizing that the Fed's probably not going to raise rates now. So everybody started getting excited. Oh, we got the risk on trades coming back. And then the NASDAQ went green. And it was up like almost 1.5% today. It was almost like the war was good for the economy, which it isn't. So even if they don't raise rates or they raise rates, it looks like they're not going to raise them 0.5 percentage point, but they raise them 0.25 point. It doesn't really matter. This war in Ukraine adds in uncertainty. So, I mean, things are nuts, like you said. So, I mean, if you go back to when COVID started, It wasn't as if the economy was strong at the time. The Fed has been undergirding the economy since 2009. If it wasn't for the Fed injecting all of this money into the economy, and on top of that, the U.S. government having these large deficits. I mean, did Trump have a deficit under 1 trillion? No, he didn't. So we have these large deficits, and then you have the Fed expanding their balance sheet. It's up to almost $9 trillion. To give you an idea, it was less than $1 trillion in 2000. So, it's basically this is the Fed's economy. This is the Fed stock market. This is a manipulated economy. The U.S. economy cannot stand on its own feet. It's been wobbling since 9/11. It's just been wobbling more and more and more. On top of that, now we have high inflation. So you mentioned 25% PPI in Germany year over year in January. The PPI for the U.S. was 9%. For the folks out there that are watching this, the PPI is Producer Price Index. That's what's coming down the pike. So that's what we can expect. Now, again, that's all kind of manufactured type of goods. But I mean, if we look across the board, everything seems to be up, right? So inflation's high. The Fed's trapped. What can they do? If they raise rates, they create a recession. That's the reason why everybody, kind of not everybody, but that's the reason why the stock market came back today, because they say, oh, the Fed's not going to raise rates. But then you have tapering. We're talking about tapering is supposed to kick into gear here. Now, what is tapering? There's for me, there's two definitions. One definition is that the Fed's balance sheet goes down, shrinks. To me, that's really what tapering is. If their balance sheet doesn't shrink, in my opinion, there's no tapering. They're just growing. They're just slowing their purchases, for instance, but they're continuing to do QE. QE either continues or it turns off. If it slows down, is that really tapering? Not in my book. If the Fed's balance sheet is expanding, that is QE. So people today that bought stocks and saw the stock market going up, they're basically saying QE is going to remain, and they're not going to raise rates, and at most 0.25%. But how does it play into gold? And from what I'm looking at, gold actually, it got hammered. It was up to 1970, went all the way down to I think 1880. Then it went back to 1900. I don't know if it got all the way down to 1880, 1880s. I know it got to 1890, and then it closed around 1900. Silver was over to about 25.50, went all the way down under 24, closed about 24. So the miners got hammered. SIL, the mining ETF, was down 5%. So the miners got hit. But the HUI it wasn't hit very hard. It closed around 280. So the miners are still in a pretty good position here. But overall, to close off this answer, the uncertainty has increased. H1 of this year, the first half of this year, we already knew there was going to be a lot of weakness in the economy, a lot of uncertainty. What's happening in Russia is just adding to that uncertainty in the first half of this year. So now we're looking at what's going to happen in H2. That's going to be the key to it all. But I mean, we could sit here and talk about this for a long time. There's so much data points. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've just been thinking about a lot is what's going to happen to our economy, because you're getting to this point, or I wouldn't even say economy, what's going to happen to society, because you're getting to a point where everybody is realizing how bad inflation is. You don't need to watch a podcast like this or have ever watched one ever, and you may have never uttered the word inflation in your house, but now you're seeing it literally everywhere. Oil's about $100 now. And so, the Fed has been talking, or at least saying, they're going to raise rates. And if they did it all, my guess would have been it would have infinitesimally small. It would have just been to say it, essentially. And they know they've been trapped between a rock and a hard place, but they've been talking about raising rates. Obviously, they can't raise them substantially because of how bad a position that we're in. And so when I look at the Russia and Ukraine situation, in a weird, demented way, it's almost the perfect blessing or excuse for the Federal Reserve to continue to do what they were already doing, but not have to posture. And I wonder, where do you think we go from here? Obviously, it's a great excuse to not raise rates, continue to print money. But when we talked about the Germany producer index, 25% highest since 1949, 7.5% inflation. We all know it's astronomically higher than that. We had Biden's administration kind of posturing and starting to build the framing of blaming inflation on what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, kind of setting that stage. And I mean, I just wonder, where does it go? Do we just go right back up the inflation ladder and we just see what happens until things get out of control? Or what do you think happens from here?
First of all, the last time we had high inflation, we had 3 recessions, 2 in the 70s or 1 in the early 80s. Inflation causes recessions. And the reason why it causes recessions is because discretionary spending collapses. And that's what we're going to see. And if you look at everybody's bills, I mean, 50% plus of the American public is living paycheck to paycheck. And so their income didn't increase 7%. It didn't increase 5%. So what's happening? So their bills are going up. And so their discretionary spending it's going away, right? And so the economy is 60, 70% consumer spending, and 70% is really the number that people use. So that's going down. So if consumer spending is going down, the economy is weak and the economy is not going to get stronger. I think we're going into recession. I think this has been building for years. The Fed has been trying to basically manipulate the economy for growth. And now they can't do it because their number one tool is the expansion of the money supply. But if they expand the money supply, inflation is going to go even higher. So what do? They're, like you mentioned, they're kind of trapped here. I think what's going to happen is, so the S&P, it reached 4818. And now we're down 11% from that high. I think that 4818 is the same equivalent as when Japan hit 47,000 back in 1989. I don't think we're going to crash like Japan did, like 70%. But I think what's going to happen is we're not going to go back to hitting a new high the rest of this decade. We're just going to muddle. So what the Fed did for the last 2 years, we were up 20% plus, in the S&P 500. I think those days are over. And now I think people don't realize this. I'm going out on a limb and calling this. I mean, people are saying, wait a minute, you're saying that 4818 on the S&P, we're not going to get higher than that for the rest of the decade? You're nuts, It's probably a terrible call on my part, but I just think that the U.S. economy here is hitting a wall, and people are I think that we're going to go into a recession this year because of inflation. And the damage that's done by COVID, all the small businesses that's been damaged, is going to be really hard to kind of rebuild, if you will. And we're going to go into what I call muddling. I don't see a crash because of technology. I think technology is going to keep us out of a crash. I see the stock market going down 15 to 20%, maybe 25, but I don't think it'll go down more than that. I'm thinking 15 to 20 is what I think is going to happen. And when it does, I don't think it's going to come back. So because the Fed's not going to be able to reignite it. So if the Fed can't reignite it, people are going to give up on the stock market, kind of like what happened in Japan. They call it the lost decade. From 1990 to 99, their stock market did nothing. Their growth did nothing. They call it the lost decade. I think the U.S. is going to have a lost decade here. It's going to be a transition. This is going to be the kind of a transitionary decade. I think is going to happen. And I think inflation is going to remain high, which is going to be is basically going to create this recession that I'm expecting. And so now let's talk about, okay, all this weakness in the economy, what does that do? The only thing, everybody's going, why do I invest in gold? Why do I invest in silver? It's never going to go higher. Well, I've been saying this. It's not, gold and silver have been trapped because of the Fed's ability to keep the economy growing. Once they lose that ability, and so from that, we've had this risk on trade. And so once it flips to risk off and Wall Street stops, once they lose their faith in the Fed, that's when you get the risk off. And that's when gold finally gets above 1950. So between 1850 and 1950, that's the last battle. Once we get above 1950, the bull market continues in gold. That's when the fear trade kicks in. And silver, it starts from 2450 to 2850. Now, isn't it interesting? Today, we were well over 2450, almost to 20. We were 2570, I think. It went all the way down under 24. They know these numbers. They don't want us above 2450. If you're above it, then that's kind of a great news. So we're fighting these little battles. We have to get above those levels before we break out.
Interesting. Now, on that note, one of the themes that I've been thinking about, because my guest's been talking about for a long time, which is essentially exiting the financial system or a psychological lack of trust, either in the financial system or fiat currency or in both. And we're starting to see a little bit of those themes play out. There was all the bank freezes in Canada. And, I think one of the top things trending on Twitter was Canadian banks for a couple days. And, I saw a lot of people talking about how they were getting all their money out of Canadian banks. I just watched right before we came onto this, I watched a video of in Ukraine, ATMs frozen. And you're in this place where people are starting to go like, hey, what's going on? And then in addition to that, along that same theme of a growing distrust in the existing fiat system or the existing central bank note system, you've got this situation with Russia, and they've basically laughed off, at least they did, who knows what'll happen, but they laughed off these sanctions, and then they've kind of pushed. We know they've been buying a lot of gold and they've been stacking all that up, but they've also started talking about Bitcoin and introducing it and making it legal. Then they've got all their energy that they're selling, and then I wonder, well, are they going to plan on selling their various products in gold or Bitcoin? So you've got this, whether it's outcast individuals like Putin or everyday people in Canada and the United States and Ukraine that are realizing something's up with the system. And I wonder, what do you think about that? And do you think something has to give? Do you think that that we're seeing the death of fiat, or do you think that that's an exaggeration?
No, I don't think it's an exaggeration at all, the death of fiat. I actually wrote a book called The Demise of America. And on the front cover is a dollar bill ripped in half. And basically the theme of the book was the dollar dying. So America is basically, kind of a corporate country. We're all about making money. We're all about business. That's always been the theme of America, going back to the 18th century when, the Industrial Revolution, 19th century. And now, so if we're not making money, something's going to give. And one of the reasons why I basically, had the dollar getting ripped in half is my belief that you cannot print your way to prosperity. And so I've always thought, once this MMT came came out, I always thought, that was basically fantasy economics. It's the whole idea that debt doesn't matter, that all you have to do, you can never go bankrupt because you can always print your way out. You can always print your interest rates, for instance. But there was a book that came out around 2016, 2017 called The Mandibles. Have you heard of that book? The Mandibles? So The Mandibles, it's a fiction book based in two families, one in New York City, one in Washington, D.C. And it all starts to break down right around 1927. And in 1927, the world, because we're printing basically, we basically did what we're doing now. She basically forecasted that we're going to try to print into infinity. And in 1927, it all basically blows up. And the rest of the world gangs up on the United States and says, we will no longer accept the US dollar as payment for your bonds and payment for your interest. You now have to pay us back in either gold or one of these currencies. And the main currency was the IMF's basket. That was one of the currencies they had to pay them back in. That was the new currency. But the world would no longer accept dollars. And so the dollar, at that point in time, the dollar crashed. It just crashed overnight. The dollar was basically worth kind of nothing. And then we had hyperinflation. But the book's fantastic. It's actually written by somebody who's not somebody that's not an economist. She's just a writer. Lionel Shriver, I think is her name. No, Lionel, yeah, that might be it. Might be wrong on the last name. But it's a fantastic book. And it's basically, telling us this is what's going to happen if you just keep printing money. That eventually the dollar is going to become worthless into fiat. And I think that's what's going to happen. And if one of the reasons why they can't raise rates is because once you implement MMT, modern monetary theory, you have to have low rates because MMT basically uses debt, high debt levels. It basically says debt doesn't matter. Debt is what you use to create liquidity. The most important thing is liquidity. You got to have liquidity in the financial system so that nothing ever melts down. And that's the whole theory behind MMT. As long as you have liquidity, and Janet Yellen, after MMT came out, Janet Yellen said, we'll never have another financial crisis in my lifetime. And the reason why she said that is because they've adopted MMT. They've adopted this idea that as long as you inject liquidity, you will not have a crash, if you will. And they basically got this idea from Japan. And then they started using it after 9/11, and then it keep increasing. Now we have $2 trillion deficits and we don't blink. So it's just a matter of time, because if you don't generate enough wealth, if you're trying to print prosperity, you're not generating enough wealth to offset it. If you're basically generating more debt than wealth, it's just a matter of time before, that Mandibles scenario kind of plays out where the rest of the world just kind of puts their hand up and says, wait a minute here, no more of this. We're not going to allow it. And so I think that your question, the answer is definitely yes. We are entering a period of the end of fiat. Will the dollar last the rest of this decade? Probably not, is my thinking. It probably won't last the rest of this decade. And so, what does that mean? So gold and silver, and mining stocks have basically been one way to hedge. And I also hedge with Bitcoin. And the reason why is because I think it's a supplementary hedge to the financial system. They might be able to control gold and silver to such an extent that they never really blast off, because if they can print using MMT, if they can print all this money, they can use paper selling to kind of control gold and silver, and you never get this hedge, this really good hedge, if you will. So if gold and silver don't work as a hedge, then maybe Bitcoin will. We don't know what Bitcoin's going to be worth. All I know is that I don't think you can clone Bitcoin. So if you can't clone Bitcoin, it's very, very rare. And then the halving creates a situation where Bitcoin could go much, much higher in value. I don't know what Bitcoin is going to be worth in 2024, 2028, but the halvings is the only thing I think really matters. So I think it's a good supplementary hedge to gold and silver as the end of fiat.
Now, what do you think's on the other side of this? Nobody knows exactly what it looks like, but what is your best hypothesis for what's on the other side of this?
Yeah, I love that question. So I wrote a constitution. It's called The New America. It's on Amazon. And the reason why I wrote I wrote it because I believe that our current constitution is not satisfactory because it was written, over 200 years ago. It's not satisfactory to present times. Now, some people say absolutely it is, but if you look at the corporate structure of today, if you look how corporations have more power over the worker, if you will. So I really think you need to have a new constitution to kind of redesign the economy. You have to have capitalism, but capitalism is flawed. So you need a strong constitution that has a balance between corporate power and employee power. And you also need a new constitution that creates equality with wealth, where the 1% don't generate all the wealth. Because free capitalism, free markets, the top 1%, the top 5% tend to accumulate all the wealth. So you have to have something in place. That's the reason why I wrote it. And I also wrote it to, it's kind of a strange constitution. I'm a unicorn when it comes to politics. I'm a utopian libertarian. Those two words aren't supposed to go together. Most libertarians are conservative. Utopian? You got to be crazy. So when I say utopian, that means I basically mean that society works for everybody. It doesn't just work for those who are successful. Basically, a libertarian conservative says that the hardest workers are going to get the most success. But I believe that that type of a society will never work, because those that don't have will eventually break down the system. And that's what we're seeing today. Basically, the progressives have gotten so angry that they've been left behind that they're basically throwing a fit. And they want to basically burn it all down. They want to rip the Constitution up and they want to start over, but they want to basically burn down our capitalist society. I mean, the average progressive is anti-capitalist, but capitalism is the only economic system that works. You just have to reform it. So me, a utopian libertarian, I want to have a small government, but I want to have a strong business. But I also want to have a big way to help those that aren't successful. So how do we do that? How do you create, a civilization where people don't necessarily have to work, but yes, society thrives? And I've tried to do that in my constitution. So when you say where we're going, I actually believe that where we are going as a society, we're in a transitional state right now, but both parties are wrong. The progressive side thinks that we could have big government and that will work. Well, we know that won't work. That creates tyranny. COVID actually, in some ways, was a blessing in disguise, because we saw what happened in Australia. We saw what happened in Canada, where tyranny reigned. And it did to a certain extent in America. Today, Biden kept talking about freedom in his speech. It was unbelievable. And then if you said freedom doesn't matter when it comes to COVID, right? Freedom does matter across the board. And we're starting to see that. So we can't have tyranny. Big government is always going to create tyranny. So big government will not work. The other side of the spectrum is a small government, a libertarian-based government, which is kind of what the Republicans want, the conservatives want. Well, that won't work either, right? And it's not, the answer isn't necessarily a combination of the both in the middle. That's not necessarily the answer either. The answer is something new. We have to create something new. And what the new is you got to have a capitalist society, but simultaneous to that, you have to have freedom. Now, you have to have some type of a mix where humanity comes into play. And this is where the Republican Conservative Party have failed us. And what they need to do is bring in humanity into the equation. You have to bring in humanity. And what is humanity? Humanity means that all people matter. And how do you do that? And that's where we're going as a civilization. We're going to reinvent ourselves where humanity matters. Everybody counts. And simultaneous to that, we don't have a big government we don't need big government telling us how to live our lives. We can do that on a local level. So what I think is going to happen is we're going to have what I call hyper-locality, hyper-local, where we basically create independent governments on a local level, but they're not really harsh and big and strong. They're just big enough to take care of people. If that makes sense. So we're going to reinvent ourselves. I'm very optimistic about where we're heading, but we're not going to go into this, materialistic type society that we have today. That won't work.
Interesting. Of course, one of the quickest, at least, band-aids would of course to have some semblance of a currency that couldn't be inflated into oblivion to continue to grow these governments and continue to grow the cost of living and make these corporations all powerful. The hyper localization is something that I think a lot about. I almost feel like there's a couple timelines. There's a timeline of group that want to be ruled. And there's a timeline of group that kind of just want to hope things kind of stay a semblance of normalcy. And then you see that there's these hyper localizations in that there's a lot of people that are saying, I don't want either of this. One of the examples I've been watching a lot of that I think is pretty interesting, that I'm certainly rooting for, and I plan to get down there and check it out, is El Salvador. That'll be interesting to watch and see what happens there. I'm really rooting for them. But I think that, to me, it's something that I think a lot about, that I kind of hold hope for, is that basically the distrust in the system and the turbulence gets so intense that essentially people opt out and they essentially start building, as you call it, these hyper localizations. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I really think that's going to happen. We have a lot of small communities that are somewhat self-reliant, but they work to help the entire community. They're built around community. They're not built around, let's see who can succeed and who can fail. It's a new mindset. I think that's where we're heading, because people are going to start to recognize that if we don't create communities that work, they will eventually end up biting us to a certain extent. So we have to create a way for the community to work. And that's where we're failing. Both political parties are not trying to create communities that work. One, I mentioned this before, one is basically trying to kind of destroy itself, and the other one just trying to hold on for dear life. And neither of them have any answers, right? Now, going back to your El Salvador, I'm rooting for them too. I'm rooting for another country to adopt Bitcoin as well, many others. I think that Bitcoin and crypto are the future of finance. They're revolutionary. People are really ignoring the potential of what these cryptocurrencies can do. I've told a few people that are really smart some of these use cases for crypto, and they're like, whoa, I didn't think of that. That's amazing. It can do, it can do that stuff. I'll give you one example of what, there's all these use cases that crypto can do that has never been possible before. That's totally revolutionary. So let's say that I'll give you two use cases that are stunning in their power. And, people don't realize how unbelievable this can happen. So let's look at just decentralized finance. So decentralized finance are basically a blockchain that's decentralized, that there's no really business around it. This isn't Bitcoin. Could be Bitcoin, but let's say it's not. It's just some other crypto, another token, if you will. So on that chain, and it doesn't necessarily, there's a lot of these different chains out there. You have the Ethereum network, you have the Solana network, there's lots of them, right? So let's just take one. Let's just take the Ethereum network. Also, Solana is the same. And let's say that you have $100,000 in Ethereum. You can take that $100,000. You can do this today. Take that $100,000 in Ethereum and lock it into a smart contract, and they will send you, say, a stable coin. Say it could be Tether, it could be another stable coin. They'll send that to you, and then you can convert that into cash, and then they hang on to your Ethereum. And this will take place in 5 minutes, and there's no people interacting with this. So all you're doing is taking that leverage, that Ethereum, and borrowing money. It's basically an AI program. You're not dealing with any people. You're not dealing with any organization, and you're borrowing money in literally less than 5 minutes. That money, and all I have to do is convert that USD or UST into cash, and you can spend it, or you could convert it into Bitcoin and then give it to somebody, spend it or whatever. And then you pay back. Then you have to pay back your loan. Once you pay back your loan, that smart contract releases your Ethereum back. No dealing with a bank, no hassle, instant loans. That's one use case. It's huge. That's going to happen globally. Why deal with a bank? If you're a small business, I don't want to deal with my banker. I'll just, as long as you have money, you can borrow money. Simple, Simon. That's one. Here's another one. Let's say you're a small manufacturer in the United States, and you buy and you need like 10 components for what you make. You can create a smart contract to automatically pay somebody in Asia, for instance. And the smart contract will release the money. Once you receive the item, they send it to you. Once you receive it, it's all locked into the smart contract. The money's released to them. There's no dealing with banks. It's all automated through a smart contract. You don't have to worry about dealing with a bank. You don't have to worry about extra fees. So international trade is huge for crypto. Making loans is huge. That's just two. There's dozens of these. So crypto is the future for finance. Let's say we talked about hyperlocality. Let's say that you trade with another. Let's say there's one small little community in Arizona, and you make stuff, right? And there's a community in Texas, and then they make stuff, and you barter. But what do you barter with? You barter with crypto. You're not dealing with banks. You basically send them some of your Bitcoin, and they send you product, back and forth, right? No banks are involved. This is all done through blockchain. That's going to happen. That's going to be the future. And, that's going to be I think it's going to happen. I don't see why it doesn't. That's kind of the money of the future, is private money.
Love it. Beautiful. I'd love to do a part 2 where we just dive into what the future could look like, and we just talk about practical solutions. It's something that I think about a lot. My daughter she turns 2 in August, and my wife's pregnant with number 2. And I look at this and I go, wow, not very good. And it's obvious that this type of decentralized finance is really the only solution. So I'd love to explore it more. My grandmother just passed away, so I have to jet back to a memorial service.
You have 5 more minutes. I want to talk about Ukraine as an end here. And then when we do that follow-up number 2, I'm going to really surprise and shock your audience with the future of spirituality, which I think goes hand in hand with where we're going, transitioning-wise, social change, economic change, political change, and spiritual change. We're going to get into that. And that's really going to kind of blow some people away, what I have to say about where we're going spiritually. So that's going to be a fun conversation. We should do that soon. Because I know you think a lot about spirituality as well. So let me talk a little about Ukraine, and then you can get off to California. So what's going on in Ukraine? So I'm reading Brzezinski's book right now, The Grand Chessboard. And I think everybody that's watching this that is interested in what's going on right now in Ukraine should read that book. Brzezinski pretty much called this shot. And this was not really, people would definitely disagree with me, but this really wasn't Russian aggression. This is the opposite. This was the U.S. aggression. And the reason why is because the U.S. started moving NATO eastward. If they wouldn't have done that, if the U.S. wouldn't have been moving NATO eastward, Poland and Hungary and then into NATO, the U.S. has been basically putting their interest into Ukraine for a long time. I mean, this goes all the way back to the 1990s. And it's really an area where we should have kind of stayed out of the Ukraine, but we didn't, and we actually, the guy that's kind of in power right now, the U.S. in many respects put him in power. And Putin, he's an old school guy. And as far as he's concerned, Ukraine is his ally. It's almost as if Canada is our ally, right? It's almost as if Canada came in and took over, China came in and took over Canada. We're not going to allow that. It's very similar to that situation. We're kind of like poking the bear to the point where, Putin finally said, I'm sorry, it was almost like his legacy. It's like he's not going to go off into the sunset and retire without resolving this. I think he felt it on his shoulders that he had to resolve this idea that Ukraine was going to be his enemy. Ukraine joins NATO and becomes, the enemy of Russia. He just wasn't going to allow that to happen. So I think so. Now it's interesting. I read today that Putin wants to negotiate with the Ukrainian government right now and kind of in this, if the Ukrainian government will agree to be a neutral ally, not necessarily a puppet of Russia, but be a neutral ally and agree to not join NATO. And I actually think that was Putin's objective at the whole time, that he just wanted NATO out of his backyard. And so this could get resolved over the next couple of weeks, or it's going to be interesting. And Russia might leave that country within 2 weeks, or it could keep going on and on and on. But in the first half of this year, even if Russia backs out, but I don't think everybody's talking today about Russia going to these additional countries. I don't think that's happening. Russia in his speech, he riled everybody up, absolutely. But in some respects, I think that he did that kind of as a chess move to basically, scare the world. And now when he backs off, and basically get everybody, hyper excited. And now when he backs off, now when he negotiates, he kind of negotiates with a little bit more, it gives him a little bit more leverage that he's basically he wants to continue this war further on. I think it was more that than it was his actual plans. I don't think that they're going to go to another country. If they invade another country after Ukraine, then the goal's going to go even higher, I think, because the economy is going to be even weaker. That's going to create a lot of instability in Europe if he goes into another country. I don't think he will. I think this is going to be resolved. I could be totally wrong, but I don't think that. I think he just wants. He says he wants them to be neutral, but it's going to be interesting to see how this all unfolds if it keeps going on and on and on. But my main point here regarding gold is that in the first half of this year, I think that the Ukraine situation creates enough uncertainty to prevent the stock market from basically rocking and rolling. We're going to have to wait until, I think, at least late spring, early summer before the stock market even thinks about a new high. So, okay, that was my 2 cents on the Ukraine.
Well, I hope you're right. Let's all everyone listening. We'll continue to pray for a peaceful resolution of some sorts, and that we don't go to some form of a World War III or some form of cyber warfare or whatever it might be. And I want to thank everyone for listening to today's episode. Make sure you hit the like button on this video if you enjoyed it. Give us a comment down below if you want to see part 2, where we break down a little bit more about the future and what it could look like, some possible solutions. So let us know in the comments right there down below. Subscribe and bell notification is what notifies you for future episodes. I will link Don's website right there down below as well. And I want to thank you for coming on today, Don.